All right. Hello, welcome to the Portland State University's Art and Social Practice Annual Conference, Assembly 2021. Thank you so much for joining us. This year, our Social Practice Conference comes to you in the form of a live television station. So what you're about to experience is not just a normal Assembly conference, it's Assembly TV. So take a look at the official Assembly TV guide on our website for event listings, project descriptions, even a drawing contest and a word search. Oh, and don't forget to read your social practice horoscope to let you know what events you should definitely be tuning into. Mo, can you drop the link in the chat? Thank you. We've got 2 amazing days left, today and tomorrow, of the conference. There's a $100 party, a sign making workshop, a collaboration between our very own Kiera Walls and her cousin Jordan Williams, and so much, much more. So tune in today and tomorrow. Tomorrow's Friday, 12 to 6 p.m. Pacific time. That's 3 to 9 Eastern time. Each assembly event will be recorded and put up on our YouTube channel for you to enjoy again and again. And if you're new to Zoom, you can check out the link in the chat for a brief overview and some tips. And finally, a note about accessibility. The daily graduate lectures will have live ASL interpretation. If you plan to utilize that, please make sure that you're joining us on Zoom rather than YouTube. And we are starting off day 4 by sharing some grieving rituals, drawing and listening to the artist Shelbie Loomis present the Grieving Walk, a socially engaged project and performance. Shelbie will be sharing her own projects and rituals that were born out of a grieving process after the death of a loved one during the pandemic. Then she will open the floor to cultivate a group discussion to share with each other reflections and ideas. Together, we can reimagine what grieving can look like. So without further ado, Shelbie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Karen. I appreciate that. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Get started. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Verbal. Perfect. Fantastic. So, hi, welcome. My name is Shelbie Loomis, and it has been a hard year. But let's talk about some grieving rituals. Before we begin, you will be needing the following. Please grab a piece of paper and draw these shapes. This page will be yours to use throughout my story that I'm going to be telling you. It is yours to do with as you wish, and I hope you will share at the end as we dream together. On the top of the page, I want you to write, I am grieving blank today. And on the second line, I'd like you to write, and I've used blank to process it. For example, someone could write, I am grieving the end of my childhood today, and I've used writing to process it. The box that you drew anywhere on the page is your drawing space. I use drawing really heavily within my grieving process, and I'm asking you to do so as well. As I'm presenting, I want you to write anything that comes to your mind about your process, thinking to a time when you had to grieve alone. After my presentation, I will ask you to share your grieving rituals and to dream together of space that we can cultivate together for healing and repair. If you're having trouble thinking of something, think about what you have lived through within the global pandemic and a year of social change. And think about the people that it has affected. It's time to re-envision public spaces and activities together. I also want you to take a deep breath. The content of this presentation might be triggering for some, and I want you to take care of your own mental and emotional states. Feel free to turn off your camera if you need to do so. I thank you for your vulnerability today, and I just want you to remember to doodle, to breathe, and to enjoy the story I'm about to tell you. Let's start from the beginning and work our way outwards. I'll be talking about my own experience and make my way to include other people's experiences. And for me, it started with her. I named her Anya. She was my grandmother, matriarch, muse, in the center of my world. My grieving rituals is a collection of drawings, social art projects, and rituals about death and grief. But for me, each of the lines of investigation can be drawn back to Anya and her influence on me that carried a ripple effect outward towards the different communities that I'm a part of. I'm interested in the stories of others and how they think about the relationships that they have as they transition past death. And I'm also interested in the discourse of grieving privately versus grieving publicly, especially now that we find ourselves in a global pandemic reality. These are how I grieve. These rituals are how I grieve publicly and privately. Drawing connections. I'm leaving you all my journals, she said, facing the shuttered window as I continued rubbing her back. But you must promise me that you will not look at them until after I'm gone. I opened the first journal. It was empty. I opened the second journal. It was empty. I opened the third. It too was empty, as was the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. Shelf after shelf after shelf. All my mother's journals were blank. And when women were birds, Terry Tempest Williams describes what it feels like to cling to ephemera or the essence of her mother after she died. But she experiences another type of death when her mother's journals are blank. She spends the rest of her life replacing the pages of her own mother's journals with her own meaning and connection. And in drawing connections, I too feel like I'm reaching out to my grandmother through ritual and artwork to feel like she's still alive. However, I still experience disappointment, pain, and heartbreak when it doesn't compare to the real connection that I'm looking for. The disappointment feels like empty pages of a blank journal page. And I am still continuing to search and add to my collection of connections, hoping that the disappointment will be replaced one day with peace. I see connection in our paintings of our favorite building. I've been searching for her within the places that we've shared together. My grandmother took a painting class when I was 15. And she painted the Randall David Audubon Center and Sanctuary. And that weekend, she took me to the same building so that we could paint it together. These two buildings on the left became her favorite pictures in our house, and she looked at them every single day. Since she died, I've drawn all the places that we've spent the most time together. St. Michael's High School on the bottom, the Randall Davy Audubon Center and Sanctuary in the middle, and the St. Francis Cathedral on top. It's a continuous drawing practice that I've been searching for her essence since, and I'm looking for her within these environments. I see connection and stick whittling, especially from the wood from this fallen poplar tree. And I see connection in our hair braided together. This piece is called Connecting with You in the Future Once I've Said Goodbye. I used wood and hair to create a sculpture after the grieving process of taking care of my grandmother over the winter break while she was dying. The wood was taken from her front yard, and it was meant for her morning fires. The hair is taken from her hairbrush as she lost it due to the late stages of cancer. The hair is combined with my own and emotional and spiritual solidarity of her dying and her death and dying process. The sculpture was allowed to disintegrate with elements over the time period of an exhibition called Hard and Soft at Congress Yards from late January until the spring equinox in 2021. The artwork acts as a timekeeper for the time that was left of her life, as well as a time marker of a grandmother and granddaughter's relationship as it transitioned past death. The idea was that the sculpture would be transformed from start to finish, by which time her dying process would have been complete and I would have said goodbye for the last time. I see connection in drawing her braided hair. When she died, my mom and my aunt took her braid for me when they took her body. It's part of my practice to draw it over and over again. In collaboration with Laura Glazer, braiding was an online event to braid hair and stories with others in the time of isolation. This event was conceptualized through individual conversations and the desire for more intimacy within our lives during COVID-19 isolation. Using braiding hair as a vehicle for sharing and experiencing. During this time together, we encouraged others to braid or do their hair however they liked and to use objects in their hairstyles. We encouraged sharing stories or memories of when we had our hair braided or what it made us think of. We wanted to cultivate a space of whimsy and laughter and silliness, and mainly just to enjoy ourselves and others. Dear Miss Gregory. Dear Miss Gregory is a series of letters from Anya's students that she taught over 25 years at St. Michael's High School. She was a religion teacher and drama teacher and taught over 3,000 or more students. 5 years before retirement, she was diagnosed with breast cancer and decided not to tell her students. She died 7 years after retirement. A few weeks before she died, I reached out to her former teacher and friend, Diane Larson and Kim Walker, to help coordinate letters from her former students and colleagues so that she would have an opportunity to not feel so alone during the pandemic and to share how much of an impact she had on her community. These letters were read to her a few days before she died. If I'm being transparent, these letters served me more than they served her. These letters gave me more insight into the teacher side of her, and I use these letters as a reflection on my own teaching philosophy, and it allows me to reflect on legacy and impact. These are some examples of those letters that we collected. Okay, we're working our way outwards. I see these two projects as sisters. The Grieving Apothecary and the Red Tent are projects that are centered around women and creating community through shared experiences. These projects hold storytelling, mysticism, and tears, and are based upon invitation only. These are projects that are meant to be experienced in person or on a one-on-one basis, and I've attached some images to glimpse inside these projects. I found myself collecting materials and placing them inside glass vials. I became interested in using intuition to cultivate ritual with other women that I asked to exchange time with. I was seeking advice and counsel in anticipation of heartbreak, but also wanted to extend the space to hold their experiences as well. After we had our session and conversation, where we selected ingredients to place within these grieving antidotes, I would send them the ones that we cultivated together and ask them to send me back an ingredient to add to the collection. This collection and practice helps me build community and intimacy with other women around death and grieving. This is some example of the packages of the packaging for the grieving antidotes after the individual sessions together. We know that 7 stages of grief is pretty prescriptive when we look at it as a linear process from start to finish. And as you can recognize from the top, it starts with shock and denial and works its way out to reconstruction. But within every session, the participant and I would decide what antidote we wanted to create together that felt authentic to the experience that we cultivated within that moment. I look at the packaging as a tongue-in-cheek nod to this oversimplification of grief and its process. In the Red Tent Conversation series, I facilitated conversations with women to share their stories on trauma, ritual, artistic and spiritual practices, and death, and then created a printed archive of our discussion. This work is inspired by the novel The Red Tent, in which the author, Anita Diant, takes a fictional approach to the biblical story of Diana from the tribe of Jacob. And in this book, the Red Tent was a place where women could go to share their private and magical worlds once a month, away from the suppressive patriarchal gaze, bonded by menstruation, childbirth, and death. For my creation of this modern day conceptual Red Tent, I staged a one-on-one conversation with women from all different types of walks of life and drew their portraits. The edited transcripts of the conversation and the portraits are going to be published in a book in 2021, this year. And the project acts as an archive from these personal narratives and these rituals that we're conducting in secret within the Red Tent. These are some examples of the portraits of some of the women that have we've spent some time within the Red Tent. I want to pivot now and kind of bring this more into a present day tense. We are halfway through 2021, and we are just beginning to come out of a global pandemic that we have never seen the likes of within our lifetime. And I want to talk about the magnitude of what our country and the world finds itself after this pandemic in terms of psychological distress. I pulled this from the CDC website that was posted in June 11th, 2020. But it talks about what to look for in terms of grief and loss, but it also talks about what to actually anticipate in complicated grief situations as well. If you know me, you know that I love to read statistics and read procedures. So I hope you bear with me as I talk a little bit about some statistics that I found that are relevant. It was predicted that by January 8th, 2021, that there would be over 86 million confirmed cases of COVID-19, including more than 1.8 million deaths. As shown in the recent studies from each COVID-19 death, about 9 family members would be affected and would grieve. It's estimated that the mass bereavement due to COVID-19 will leave behind nearly 16 million newly bereaved people globally. I just want to say 16 million people. If death of close friends were counted, this number would be even larger. Even the lasting impact on the bereaved population brought by COVID-19 pandemic, delivering that efficient care for people who were bereaved due to COVID-19 has become one of the world's largest challenges. After a close person dies, 9.8% of people will develop prolonged grief disorder, PGD. It's also known as complicated grief. A person older than 65 who loses a spouse has a shockingly elevated risk of dying over that next year. And that's estimated range of 15 to 30% higher risk of dying. There are many reasons why this number is being elevated. And just to kind of give some context, our loved ones take care of us when we're sick. They prod us to get out, to be checked by a doctor. They provide emotional and sometimes even financial support. And when a loved one is taken from the picture, so many of the cracks can form within the foundations of our lives. There is quite literally a condition called broken heart syndrome. And it's basically where there's a reaction or surge of stress. The heart's left ventricle weakens. We find ourselves in a place where we need to expel the stress and the pain of our loss and the loss of the normalcy, the social support, the financial stability, to mourn racial inequalities, or just to mourn the loved ones that we lost. We have carried so much for so long that we need to be able to do it in a way that is not so isolating and alone. I found this image that I'm presenting that was a projection on the Brooklyn Bridge on the COVID-19 Remembrance Day in March. And I just wanted to show some of the ways that we can start to integrate some of this back into our society so that we could reflect more on it. So my question to you is, what can we be doing differently? What is the difference between now versus how we've been doing it in the past? I don't know. I think that there's a lot of work to be done, but I know that this is what I've come up with. The grieving walk. After I lost my grandmother to cancer, I found myself questioning what the grieving process looked like now that these traditional ways of grieving were starting to fall short. I suddenly found myself confronted with how social support and public practices were replaced with social distancing and Zoom funerals. Being confused and in pain, I found myself walking every day because the grief felt like fear in my body. And the only way to get rid of it was to walk. I was advised by Harold Fletcher to invite others to walk with me and how to make this work publicly. I evaluated what I wanted to work and explore through in a walking, socially engaged project for myself and for others. And I landed on it had to be consistency. It had to have consistency, simplicity, and vulnerability. I started to think of how the process of grief could leave an impression on the environment and allow for the public spaces to hold the grief. Since I have a strong studio practice in drawing, I was interested in thinking about how a continuous line drawing with the use of chalk could be left behind while walking in a t-shirt that states that I was grieving. I wanted to see how the public could react within this new grief ritual, and if they would dedicate a moment of their time to their own grief after the pandemic. My expectations from this project was to continue to walk as long as I was grieving, which was very possible that I could be walking for the rest of my life, depending on the process. The project asks others to enter into the space to stand in solidarity with those who are grieving, and to be vulnerable with those who lost the most, and to be making up for the time that was lost in isolation. The grieving walk is still ongoing today, and it happens every Monday from 3 to 4, where I start in front of this building on the right-hand side called FMH on the Portland State University's campus. I initiate it by leaving a sign and leaving a walking stick with a piece of chalk as an entry point for participation. I've been doing this for many weeks now. I started in April, and I've been doing this almost 10 weeks. And for every time that I do this, I keep a journal to kind of write down my experiences. And in the beginning of the walk for the first month, it was very exposing and really difficult for me to be doing this on my own in terms of my own grieving process. And I noticed that I would cling to certain things like putting headphones on so that I felt like I could keep within my own little world. But as I created more comfortability within that environment, I took off the headphones, and people started engaging. I got my first walker on May 24th. His name was Lorenzo, and he had noticed that I was coming there every week to draw and to walk. And he decided to come out and have a conversation with me. And though he didn't have a personal story about losing anyone particularly, we talked a lot about life and a lot about what it means to help people in time of stress. He plans on being a firefighter one day. I walked on Memorial Day, and during this time, I actually invited my partner, Chuck, to come with me to walk. And suddenly, when there was 2 people walking, there was way more activation and participation within the project. One of the first walkers of the day, her name was Sierra, and she picked up the chalk and did a full pass. She didn't share her story, but she was happy to take a picture. And she just felt like it was a beautiful representation of what this could mean for a community. And I ran into this woman, the woman on the right, her name is Fiona. And she actually was taking a walk with her dog because that day was a very emotionally charged day. She had lost her cousin 1 year to the day. And she came out and noticed this performance and decided to engage. And it was very emotional for her. And I had a lot of people who were asking what this was and had a lot of interest, thinking about, could this be the world's longest jellyfish or a large snail race? And once they saw the sign, we had a lot more conversations individually. And so I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to stop and come back, because I want to hear from you. How can we share our rituals more publicly? And I'm going to pause and stop sharing.
Can I share?
Okay.
Can you hear me?
So I asked you, hopefully you felt included to take the opportunity to draw or maybe to write down certain parts of your processes. And I was hoping to open this floor up for discussion, questions, or even just to talk about the activity as a whole. So I'll leave it there. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Kinda.
How about now? Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Okay. Well, I wanted to share 2 of the rituals I've been doing since my mother passed. One thing that I found myself doing immediately was painting the room she died in, because there was something like that I wanted to redo or make brighter or bring joy back into that room. And so I slowly started painting each room in the house because we lived together. So I would take all the objects down and then paint, and then very carefully select the objects that reminded me of her or us together, and reclaim each room. I have now successfully repainted everything except for the bathrooms. And now I'm doing the outside of the house, which is interesting. That was an extremely important thing for me to do because I needed to physically move and I couldn't sleep. And it was something I could do in the night when I was grieving, that I could physically move and use color to help with my emotional state. So I picked bright colors like, blues and yellow and that kind of thing. So it really did help. The other thing that I found myself doing was I found this mountain. There's a small, it's not really, it's kind of in between a hill and a mountain. In Santa Fe, it's kind of dry in different places. And there's a place called the Hondo Arroyo Open Space. And there's this mountain that you can climb and walk around the mountain in about 45 minutes. It's about a 45-minute walk. And I just found that I needed to do this hike every day, and would get out, do this hike every day. And I noticed at the end of this trail that I was on that there was a bench, a cement bench, that was dedicated to the trail steward. His name was Dr. Bill Johnson. And a lot of times I would get to the end of my hike and sit on this bench and look out at the view of the mountains below and the valley below, and just this incredible scenery. And think about my mom. A lot of times I talk openly to my mom on this bench. So one day I got it in my head that I wanted to sing from that bench. I studied opera and I perform, but it's been a while since I performed during this process of my mom's death. So I packed my laptop and my amplifier and I hiked the mountain, and I got to the end of the trail and got to the bench. And that particular day I noticed there were flowers underneath the bench. So I thought it was strange, and I looked at the card and it was dedicated to Dr. Bill Johnson. And I thought that was interesting and how poignant it was that I was going to sing from the bench. So I just started singing all the arias I could think of. O mio babino caro, Quel bel sogno. And I'm singing from this mountain in the middle of this wilderness off of this trail with amplified music. But just my voice, I'm not mic'd. And I noticed on another mountain this couple stopping and looking in my direction. It was really far away. I was like, certainly they can't hear me from way over there. And so I get to the end of all the songs that I had, and I'm about to play You'll Never Walk Alone from Carousel. It was going to be the last song that I sang. And this couple comes around the trail and looks at me and says, and I stopped the music, and he said, "Did you know Bill Johnson?" I said, "No, I just saw the flowers. I sit on this bench. My mother passed away. This is a walk that I do every day." He was the trail steward. He said, "Yes, he was my father." And he burst into tears. And he said, "He just died 2 days ago." And he said, "We were over on the other mountain and we heard you singing, like so clear, just right in front of our faces. And we couldn't believe it. And so we came around to meet you and talk to you." And I said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe it." I said, "Can I sing you a song?" And he said, "I would really appreciate that." So I sang him You'll Never Walk Alone, and we all cried. But I thought it was so interesting because I had never done that, where I just spontaneously sung in public, and didn't know anything about this situation. But when I opened myself up in my grief and shared my grief with other people, all of a sudden something beautiful came out of it, and I made this incredible connection. And so I really appreciate this idea of transforming this. It's the isolation when you're grieving that makes it so much worse, because you feel alone. You feel like no one else could possibly understand your pain. But when you open yourself up to other people and share that grief with other people, all of a sudden, I've met 8 different people just within the last 3 weeks who have lost someone in the last 6 months. It's incredibly prevalent right now, and there are a lot of people who are grieving.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate that. And you're right. It's interesting how if we took this individual journey and we made it more, if we could create some kind of normalcy of showing this more publicly, we can connect on a deeper level. And that's one of the things we talk a lot about in this program is how could we make, try to make this more public, make these projects, have them more seen. And, I think that there's a lot of benefit there. Does anyone else have any other examples? Any rituals?
I have a daily ritual that I do every day. And I first started doing it after I went through a bad breakup in like 2019, and I got super addicted to tarot. Super addicted. I mean, I would like go on YouTube and do reading, and I reading daily. And what was interesting about that ritual is that sometimes, like, especially for me personally, it's very hard to be vulnerable with the people around you. Because in a lot of sense, like vulnerability, for me, I have a weird connection that it somehow makes me weak, or, I can't 100% be too vulnerable with that without that being used against me. But when it came to tarot, I found a whole online community of people who were grieving over lost relationships, grieving over deceased loved ones, grieving over a ton of things. And what's nice about tarot is that you have this conversation with an inanimate object,
Mm.
conversation with yourself, and you can kind of put meaning into that, like, in any way. And so it helps you feel connected without, you know, completely tapping into that fear of, like, being too vulnerable. And I guess it is like a vulnerability, but like, grieving in private, but you still have like a community or a sense of community. So to this day, I do tarot every day, sometimes like 3 or 4 times a day, whether it's me doing readings for myself or me looking up a pick a card reading on YouTube. Um, and that's how I've coped with a lot of loss. And then it has translated into me doing readings for other people that have been really, healing and primarily centered around grief, because that's what calls us out. That's what, heartbreak is what breaks us open, right? And so I found it to be a very, very powerful tool for me personally.
Yeah. I liked what you said. Heartbreak breaks us open. And I think that that's what allows us to relate to each other more in a more authentic way. So thanks for sharing. I appreciate it. Does anyone else have any rituals they'd like to share? Anyone? And I can also open up for conversation or questions.
I think I'll add one thing.
Yeah.
Growing up, I saw my mom, who's actually here, light a yard site candle for each time, the anniversary of someone's death. And I remember being a little kid and just being like uncertain of what that was. And now, as more people in my life have died, I think back to those candles being in our kitchen and burning for 24 hours. And it's not something I do in my own practice, but just this conversation is bringing that image back to mind. Even when I'm in the grocery store and I see yard site candles for sale, and I'm like, oh, when will I start doing that? When will I start buying one of those to commemorate the anniversary of the death of somebody?
Yeah, it's interesting how, we're kind of exposed to a lot of different rituals and how they, we don't know the impression of that ritual until it actually happens, and it kind of transforms within our own lives and it becomes activated in its own variation. I think about that often for myself, and I'm always trying to make connections to where the root of that came from, to how it's living in my life as well. But thanks for sharing, Laura. Anyone else?
I have something I want to share. And I was thinking about the image you showed of your grandmother's braid. And when my grandmother died in 2014, I had the privilege to be able to go to her body after she passed. And I cut a little snippet of her hair. And so I had that. And I connected with a local blacksmith, who made this necklace that I'm about to share. And so it looks kind of like a stone, but that's my grandmother's hair.
Wow.
covered in resin in this like metal casing. And so it's not really a ritual per se, but when I feel kind of like unsafe, or when I'm about to do something that I'm afraid of, or like I don't want to like go into this space, or like if I have a presentation, sometimes I'll wear this necklace so that I feel protected.
Thanks for sharing, Rebecca. I appreciate that. I'm really interested in that as like a material, but also like there's a lot of history in terms of using hair. I didn't share it in the presentation, but there used to be a custom that whenever a family member got married or when they died, that they would take a snippet of their hair, but they would braid it into a wreath. And so there's a whole family legacy of these like hair wreaths, which is really, really weird, but also like really fascinating. And it's just interesting to think about how a family member or we can create these remembrances in our lives that are like these touchstones that we can connect to. So yeah, anyone else? Any further thoughts, final thoughts? Anyone? We have about 4 minutes.
Jamie, I wanted to say that after the loss of a family member a few years ago, I did one portrait for their family and for their close family, her mom. And it was the hardest thing I've ever painted. And I never expected that to go through. I went through drafts and I went through all kinds of roller coasters during the process. And it's kind of amazing what using a tool like that to kind of process a loss will do inside your body.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you bring that up, because I drew everyone's portrait for this assembly TV, which I would imagine there's probably going to be another link in the chat. But I drew everyone's portrait to be a part of Assembly TV Guide. And I realized how through the course of drawing someone's portrait, you really become very intimately involved and almost fall in love with them in some kind of way, because you get to see all of the parts that make them individuals. And for a lot of people, that's very exposing. And so I tend not to talk about it too much, because they're like, oh my God, you saw all my imperfections. But I also feel like it's a way of sharing gratefulness and kind of doing, again, another ritual. So yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for your vulnerability. I know that was really difficult, especially to start a day 4. And I just want to close with just sharing that I really hope that you think about this moving forward and bringing that into your community. We have so many people who are going to need that strength of vulnerability. And someone said, I think it was Snow, that sometimes we think about weakness and that vulnerability is weakness, but in truth, it's really strength. So I really appreciate everyone sharing, and thanks for coming to my talk.
Thanks, Shelby. That was touching. Yeah, so we're gonna take a little break, and we'll be back at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Fibra Collectivo, and we're excited for that in just a few minutes. So go ahead and hang out or get yourself a snack.